Peace. My name is Allah Forever. I'm the creator and owner of BabyBeautiful.co, which is an online baby store that we sell baby clothes. This is one of my videos that I've done for the time period since the establishment of the online baby store until now. I've been doing videos to get the word out, to make the public aware of the online baby store, because I wanted to become a household name where we will be able to build an economic base to create businesses and communities for the future generations of the children that are born today and the ones that are already in the world. We want to secure and protect their development and growth in normal functioning lives as children. So that is the purpose of the online baby store called BabyBeautiful.co. I want to take a moment to thank all those who supported the store and continue to do so, and ask those who have not yet given their support to join the family and become a part of our growing family to secure the future generation of our children of tomorrow. So I would hope that you join in that mission with us. Now, each week I do a video, and it's always pertaining to the babies, because I come from a long tradition and background of a history and nation where we teach that the babies are the greatest. The man who established our nation, Allah, taught, save the babies, they are the greatest. That's what he told us. That's our mission. So quite naturally, me establishing an online baby store would be a part of that very mission. And each week I do a video that focuses on that. Now today's video is going to be focusing on Africa, the continent of Africa. What does it mean to us as a people? I'm talking about Black people in America. And what does it mean to the world as a continent? Not a country, a continent. Africa is a continent with 55 different countries that exist in that one continent. Now, I decided to do a video about that because I've been studying African history for more than 30 years now and have been teaching it for that amount of time also. And in all my research, study, and reading about African history and its people on the continent, I've learned a whole lot in terms of who we are as a people living in America. Now, I've studied under some of the most greatest and well-known historians that have ever written about African history and its people. And in doing that, I had the privilege and honor to take a class back in 1987 when I attended Malcolm King College in Harlem, New York. where it was established by a black woman named Mattie Cook. She established Malcolm King College in the middle of Harlem, New York. And when she established that college, her idea was to establish a college in the middle of Harlem. And she did that. Well, I had the privilege of attending that college. Unfortunately, at the time that I was attending the college, she passed away during that time period. But when I attended the college in 1987, I took a class dealing with history, African history, that was taught by the instructor, Dr. Yusuf Ben Chakanin. At the time, he was a well-known historian, writer, and researcher of African history. He has since passed away. But some of the most important works that he wrote was the reason why I decided to attend Malcolm King College. Now, the college itself was established with the symbol of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King coming together like this. It was the symbol of their faces. Now, when I attended that college and took Dr. Yusuf Ben Chakanin's class, I was already familiar with his works because I had read many of his works. But one of the most important works that he wrote was titled Africa, Mother of Western Civilization. That was one of the books that I read by him before I attended the college. And also, another one of his works was Black Man of the Nile and His Family. Third one that I read by him was African Origins of Major Western Religions. I was impressed with his works, and that's why I decided to attend that college specifically because I wanted to take his class. Well, I was able to do that while attending the college, and my last class was in his house on 135th Street in Lenox Terrace. That's where he lived at the time, right across from Harlem Hospital. I was equally impressed when I went to his house and he had a collection of books that I was amazed by on African history, that one room itself was covered with all books. Just one room had stacks, piles of books. And I was even more impressed with that. There was times that Dr. Ben did not make it to the class to teach the class. It was on a Thursday that I had the class. And his partner, Professor Simmons, who was a historian in his own right, he was his partner. He would take the class. In fact, the night that we was scheduled to be in his house, that was our last class, Professor Simmons was the one who was conducting the class inside of Dr. Ben's house because he was on a speaking engagement, which he told us he would be there a little later. He did arrive a little later and wind up taking over the class for the rest of the period. But while I was there, I was amazed by the collection of books that he had gathered throughout the years on African history. And that basically started the journey for me in terms of researching, studying, and reading about African history on a serious level. Now, there's been many things written about African history from historians, writers, and educators throughout the years, both black and white. And in many of those works, many of them have given false images of Africa, its people, and how they lived. And in some of them, they've covered actual truth about Africa. But far too many of them have written about Africa in a fantasy world. Africa from the perspective of Europeans who had this framework of Africa as a people that contributed nothing to the world and to civilization. And these images that their works have created throughout the years wind up becoming a part of books, periodicals, newspaper magazines that eventually made its way into the American public school system. It was there that those books, articles, magazines, newspapers would begin to shape the minds of young black children growing up in America with no sense of identity of who they were, where they came from, how did they get here, and what was the purpose of them being brought here. Many of them had no idea of their own history and roots. These books, newspapers, magazines that was written by all of these different people who was writing about Africa had gave a false image of Africa, its people, and its history to the world. That false image has shaped the minds of so many black people in America that when you hear the word Africa, many of them don't even identify with it at all. They don't see themselves as being African in any regard. They consider themselves to be Americans. And this is as a result of the false information, the miseducation, and the indoctrination of the American public school system. Europeans have shaped our view of history. And because of that, we do not identify with our own history as a people. But many of us don't even know this absolute fact. We go on each day as if it is normal to function, live, and identify with being American. Even those who go to the best colleges and universities get the highest degrees that they can offer. PhDs in this and PhDs in that. They too have been shaped by the same American public educational system that has caused them to not identify with anything African and identify with everything American. Africa has given to the world its first lessons in humanity. Africa is the birthplace of the first human beings in the world. But this is something that you will not learn or know about through the American public school system. Africa gave the world civilization. Before there was any people in the world civilized, Africans were the ones who were the first to understand what civilization meant. They were the first to grow food, deal with agriculture. They were the first to deal with the arts, the sciences, mathematics, language, writing. All of these different sciences were first known by African people. It was African people that taught the world what we know as civilization. But because many of us have been shaped by the American public school system, we do not know the facts of our own history and roots as a people. Because others have written our history and they have told us what our history is and what it means to us. There was something that Julius K. Nyerere, who was the president of Tanzania in the 1960s, when Malcolm visited Africa, he also met him. Julius K. Nyerere said, "Whosoever controls the minds of our children control our future." Let me say that again. Julius K. Nyerere, who was the president of Tanzania, that's in East Africa, he said, "Whosoever controls the minds of our children control our future." Now, of course, many of us don't really know what that means because we've been taught as blacks living in America, that when your child reaches a certain age, you are to put your child into the public school system so that they can become indoctrinated with the American way of life. And that's what we do because that's all we know. So they become subjected to the same things that we were subjected to growing up as children in the American public school system. The false information, the miseducation, the indoctrination, all of this shaped our conscience and who we became as a people. So we no longer was able to identify with Africa as our homeland because we were shaped by the American public school system. And that taught us through the images that they showed us of Africa, the Tarzan movies, and Africans running around in jungles naked with spears and no form of civilization. And that Europeans had to come and rescue them or save them from living that way of life and brought them to America, where they became civilized. These are the images and things that are taught to us as a people in the American public school system. And these images that are taught to us shape our consciousness, shape our perception of who we are. It shaped us as individuals and our identity as a people. These false images is the reason why many black people in America today don't identify with anything African. They refuse to even be associated with Africa. But if they knew the rich cultural history of Africa and knew that Africa gave its gift of civilization to the world before any people was ever in the world or even knew of what civilization was. And that includes the Europeans, who were the colonizers and the conquerors of many parts of Africa and exploited the resources, the rich minerals in Africa, and still exploit it today. That's what enriched all of the European countries around the world. The gold, the diamonds, the ivory, all of the rich minerals of Africa has been exploited by European powers all around the world. This is how they became a dominant power. But we can't fail to mention that the most important resource that Africa ever gave to the world and had to offer the world was its own people. And that is what the Europeans took advantage of. That started the transatlantic slave trade, because Europeans ripped Africa of its most valuable resource. That was its people. And it spreaded its people all throughout the world in enslavement to enrich European countries all around the world. This is how the Europeans became a dominant power. Now, there's many African historians, writers, and educators that have been writing about this for decades. But since many of us don't read, research, or study, we don't know our own history. We rely upon the European educational system to tell us our history. That will never happen. Until we become more conscious of taking the role of learning our own history, we will continue to be victimized by the European educational system. And many years have passed, and many of us still do not know our own history. Not only don't know it, we don't even identify with it. We don't even consider ourselves Africans. That is the most saddest thing of our history, because we refuse to acknowledge it, because many of us don't know. And that's as a result of being miseducated, given false information, and indoctrinated to the American public school system, that we don't know our own history. That is the sad part of the whole thing. Now, when I started to study, research, and read about African history, I began to gather a whole lot of books, articles, newspapers, magazines, and I went into thorough research on the background of my own people. And in all those years, I've learned a lot about African history. It has shaped my consciousness in a way that I could have never experienced had I not went through research and reading and studying my own African history. In the 1960s, many Black movements and organizations began to call for a study of their own history and their own people on the continent of Africa. They not only called for it, but they had a mass movement towards making that happen. And that's what created the Black Studies programs in many colleges and universities. And some on the lower level of the public school system. But even that was not enough. Although it was a start and a beginning for a reawakening of Black consciousness, Black awareness in their own history. But we still needed more. Because you can't expect others to teach you your story and your glory. You have to find your story and your glory in your own history. Others will not teach you that. You have to learn that on your own. Europeans is only going to teach from a Eurocentric perspective. That means they view the world from the perspective of them as a people. They will never teach you the Afrocentric perspective, meaning viewing the world from the perspective of African people, its history, traditions, culture, and way of life. That's from an Afrocentric perspective. They can't teach you that and never will teach you that. The only way to learn that is you have to research, read, and study about your own history and your own people. The facts are there. Anthropology, paleontology, archaeology, all of these different sciences have researched and studied and brought all kinds of artifacts, remains of the ancient past to prove that African people were the first people ever in the world and that they gave civilization to the world. Before other people in the world knew anything about what civilization was, African people had already been living that for hundreds and thousands of years. Before Europeans even knew how to use fire or how to grow crops, how to plant and cultivate land, how to build houses and homes. African people knew all of this way before the Europeans even had an idea. One of the most important works that I read in all of my researching and studying was written by George G.M. James, called Stolen Legacy. And his thesis statement in the beginning of the book, he says the Greeks were not the authors of Greek philosophy, but the people of North Africa, commonly called the Egyptians. Now, George G.M. James wrote his book, Stolen Legacy, in 1954. At the time that he wrote his book, there was not many Black historians, scholars, or educators writing about Africa and its people from a positive perspective during that time period. But his work would be very controversial during the time that he wrote it, because many were still under the false information, miseducation, and indoctrination of the European education system, that they actually challenged what he was saying in his books, Stolen Legacy, because he challenged the whole premise of civilization coming from the Greeks. People like Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. These are the people that the European education system hold up as the philosophers that really rolled out what later would become civilization, the Greeks. Well, George G.M. James challenged that whole premise. And when his book came out in 1954, the same year he mysteriously disappeared. No one had heard or seen him ever since. It has never been disclosed as to what actually happened to him. All that we know is that the same year his book, Stolen Legacy, came out, 1954, he mysteriously disappeared. That was striking. A major work on African people by a world-renowned historian, because George G.M. James was well-learned. He had went to the best colleges and universities. He got his degrees, and he was able to do research and studying, and he wrote Stolen Legacy that became later a classic work. As the years went on, many began to write about African history and his people. You had historians, educators, and writers, both black and white, that began to write about Africa. It could easily be argued that Africa is one of the most written about subjects of all times. But it could equally be argued that it is one of the most misunderstood subjects of all times because of the false information and miseducation and indoctrination that surrounds Africa. It is misunderstood by many. Although many historians have written about it, In America, we have many black historians like Dr. Yusuf Ben Jochannan, Dr. John N. E. Clarke, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Chancellor Williams, John G. Jackson, J.A. Rogers. I mean, I can go down the line in naming many different black historians who've written about Africa from a positive perspective to change the myth about Africa from the negative perspective. But in order for you to understand or know, you have to read them. We even have African historians like Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga, who have written extensively and have done thorough research about Africa. And Sheikh Anta Diop was from Senegal. That's in the western part of Africa. And his partner, Theophile Obenga, have written extensively about Africa also. One of the classic works that Sheikh Anta Diop wrote was Civilization or Barbarism. That was his last book. But one of his first books to be translated in English from French, because he lived in Senegal. He was born and raised in Senegal, but the French had colonized that area, which is what I was speaking about, how Europeans have colonized many parts of the African continent, or the French had colonized that area. When he wrote his book, African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, it had to be translated in English. And Dr. John N. E. Clarke speaks about that. And he says that it took him 7 years to help get Sheikh Anta Diop's book translated into English. Well, when they did that, Sheikh Anta Diop work now was able to play a role in reawakening the consciousness of blacks in America to their own history and culture of Africa. Because his works was in a major works in the sense that not only was he a historian, but he was a linguist. He was one who was a scientist. So he was able to not just research and study and write about Africa, but he was able to do a lot of the testing of different mummies, the melanin count, because he was a scientist. So he was able to go into not just taking things on face value, he was able to do the work himself. So his works became a major part of the reawakening process of blacks in America. But it would only touch a small percentage of blacks in America, because most blacks in America never even heard of Cheikh Anta Diop. So they quite naturally would not know of his works. Because I just mentioned two of his books, but he wrote many different books that I've read and researched. So if you're interested in learning about that, you can look up many of his different works. But African Origins of Major Western Religions, that one by Dr. Ben is very good too. But Cheikh Anta Diop's book, Civilization of Barbarism, which was his last works, is classic now, today. And his works, African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, is another classic. But Dr. John Henry Clarke wrote a very important work too, called African Origins. Well, no, that one was Dr. Ben. John Henry Clarke book, Africans at the Crossroads. That one is very informative. I'm not sure if it's still in print. Well, I'm almost sure it's no longer in print. But there's one copy that still remains in the Schomburg Library. But the book is no longer in print. See, a lot of these works that was written by many black historians with attempts to reawaken the consciousness of black people in America, many of them are out of print. But there's still a lot of them that's still in print. And if you really want to learn and know about your own history and about Africa, there's a lot of these books that's still available in many bookstores. That's if you really want to learn about it. Because I think that there needs to be a reawakening again in terms of blacks in America with their own history of Africa. Because so many of us are so far gone and so far removed from our own history that we don't know who we are, where we came from, how we got here, when and why. These are questions that's not even on the minds of many of our people, because they've already been indoctrinated to the American way of life. So to them, everything is normal. And how can you teach your children, the next generation, if you yourself don't know? We have children that are in the world today and children that will be born in the world of tomorrow that their parents don't even know their own history. So how are they going to pass it to the next generation, their own children? If you look at every people that live in America or come to America, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Asians, Koreans, the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews, all of these different people that come to America, the one thing that they all have in common is that they all hold on to their history and their roots. We are the only people that still, after 500 years, still do not have our own true history. And this is a shame because there was a time in our history as a people where we were deprived of everything. We wasn't even allowed to read anything. Not only we were not allowed to read anything, we were not even allowed to learn to read. I remember reading the story of Frederick Douglass, who was a black slave that escaped slavery and made it to the North. He escaped slavery in the South, made it to the North, and he joined the abolition movement. That was the movement that was fighting against slavery. They was fighting to end slavery. And they were the Quakers. Quakers was a religious organization that felt that enslaving other human beings was wrong. And they were white people, Quakers. Now, not all Quakers were against slavery, but for the most part, you had some of them that they joined, they established an abolition movement to end slavery, because that's what abolition means, the end of slavery. And when Frederick Douglass escaped the South, he came up to the North and he joined that movement. For the rest of his life, he would fight against slavery and fight to free his own people. Through his speeches, through moving all across the country, speaking, telling his story. He even wrote his book. And that was in the 1800s. And he couldn't read and write himself, but he learned how to read and write. And he used that as a means to help in the struggle for his own people. Now today, many of us can read and write, but we don't read. about our own history. Yeah, we read about all kind of other stuff, but we don't read about our own history. We need to learn, study, and research about our own history. Because many of the problems that we have today as a people is because we lack the knowledge of our own history. If we had the knowledge of our own history, we would have the pride, the dignity, and the respect for ourselves, our history, and our people to the point where we would do something about our situation. When you take many blacks that learn about their own history, it develops a sense of pride and dignity within them where they know that they can do better and be better. That's the kind of confidence that knowing your own history instills in you. But if you don't know that, then you're liable to do anything because you have no sense of value in yourself, no sense of identity of who you are. So you're just liable to do anything at any given time, anywhere, with anybody, because you don't know your own history. You have no sense of identity. So all the things that you do is not coming from a base of values, morals, and principles that's rooted in your own history. It's coming from things that you've learned just to survive on, to stay alive. And the base of the false information, the miseducation, and indoctrination that you were taught as a child, passed down from generation to generation. This is how we live every day as a people in America. And we don't have a problem with it because we don't know. That's why we don't have a problem with it. We don't know. Now, if some of us start to learn, to research, and study about our own history and begin to develop the pride, the dignity, and the respect within ourselves, the sense of identity within ourselves, then we would have a different view of the world, a different view of ourselves, and what we can do in the world. But because we don't know these things, that doesn't happen. You know how many people I see day in and day out that are amazed by the fact that I wear African clothes? Many of them don't even know what the clothes is that I wear. They just know that it's different. And some of them want to take pictures of me, ask me all kind of questions. But what many of them don't know is that when I wear African clothes, I walk in the pride, the spirit, and consciousness of my own people. the many struggles, sacrifices that my own people made throughout the course of history to survive, stay alive, and live life. I walk with all of that when I wear African clothes. I take pride in my own people and my own history. That's because I know, but there was a time that I didn't know. As a young man growing up in the South Bronx, I didn't know my history. So I was like the average young man growing up in the South Bronx. I did all kind of things that were not reflective of my history because I didn't know it. It was reflective of what I was influenced by, surrounded by, and misinformed by. Those are the things that caused me to do and live the way I was living. And my own family didn't know anything about it, any history, because they was in the same state of mind as me, which is what the average black family in America is. We don't know our own history. So we base everything upon American history. What we learn, read, all of those things shape who we become as individuals and as people. This is all we know. So in order for us to learn our own history, we have to begin to challenge ourselves by asking ourselves, who are we? Where did we come from? How did we get here? We need to ask these questions. And then we need to answer them after we ask them. Because it will explain a lot of what has happened to us as a people and why we are in the conditions that we are in today. Unfortunately, many of us will die in a state of darkness about our own history. Many of us will never know or learn our own history because it wouldn't even matter to us whether we knew it or not. That's how far gone that we are as a people. And I speak to many black people, and I get the sense that it doesn't even matter to them. The only thing that matters to them is the here and now. Nothing else matters. That's the condition and state of mind that many of us are in. And that's because we don't know who we are. And many of us don't even want to acknowledge who we are. Even if someone tells us, we push away from that. That's how far gone we are as a people. I've made a decision a long time ago that I refuse to be even identified with any woman in a relationship on any level if she doesn't identify with her own history, doesn't know who she is. Because what kind of children would she produce for me if she don't know who she is? She has no sense of identity within herself. Just look at the children that's being produced by all the young mothers and fathers that don't know who they are. They are examples of what I'm talking about. And that's because they didn't know who they was. So they passed that down to their children. So each generation don't know who they are, so they can't do anything about their conditions because they don't know who they are. They have no idea of their own identity. So when people see me and see the way I dress, they are somewhat amazed by that. It's because they've been conditioned and shaped to think a certain way, to dress a certain way. And that's all European clothes. And if you don't fall in line with that, they see something odd about you. Not about them, because to them, they're normal. To them, I'm the abnormal. They're normal. This is the state of mind that they exist in. Keeping up on the latest styles, all European clothes though. Nothing African. They don't want to deal with anything African. That's because the state of conditioning is something that has control of how they think. They can't begin to even understand anything about their own history. Because they don't even want to acknowledge anything about it. And the children that they produce, unfortunately, will go through the same process that they went through. The indoctrination, false information, and miseducation of the American public school system, because that's where it all starts, right there. And then it continues throughout the course of their lives, just as it did with many of us. I was just fortunate. At 17 years old, I got knowledge of self. And that opened the door for me to see that there was more to this than what was right in front of me. But I had to go through a lot of changes within myself. I had to go through a process to see that. But nevertheless, it happened because I made it happen. Not because I wanted it to happen or I believed it could happen. I made it happen. It has to be on your own initiative that you take the steps to awaken yourself to your own identity and history. Because no one else is going to do that for you. While we are taught that Africa is a poor land and the people are starving and it's nothing but jungles and people running around half naked and some naked, the Europeans all around the world is exploiting the richness of Africa to enrich themselves in their own countries. And we believe in that Africa is a torn land, it's underdeveloped, poor land, that you wouldn't want to live there. But many of the Europeans are not under that false notion at all. That's why they're there and have been there, exploiting the land, its people, and resources for many, many, far too many years. And we, as Black people in America, don't know that. We still are under the false images that they have taught us about Africa and its people. It's a very small percentage of us that really know the truth about Africa. Very small percentage. So if we are to really change that perception about Africa, we have to change our individual perception by researching, studying, reading about our own history and roots as a people. That's the only way that we will be able to change the image and the negative perception about Africa and our own people. We can do that so that the future generations of our children will not be under the false perceptions that we was under. But we have to even take it a step further. We have to start teaching and educating our own children before they enter the American public school system, so that they will not be indoctrinated with this false information and miseducation. That is a long process. But we can do it if we really seriously want to change. It starts with us as individuals. We have to start to read, research, and study about our own history and roots. And then we have to take what we learn and start to implement that in our own individual lives. Don't just research, study, and read about your history and your roots and then leave it at that. Don't do nothing about it. We have to incorporate the values, the morals, the principles, the history, and the culture in us as individuals, so that it can change our perception of the world, change the way that we interact and deal with people in the world, change the way that we think as individuals. If we're not going to do that, it don't make no sense of researching, studying, and reading about Africa. Because if we don't incorporate the values, morals, and principles within ourselves of our own history and roots, it won't matter that we read about this, researched about it, studied about it. So what does it matter? It didn't change who we are as a people. It didn't change our individual self. We still remain the same. We still do the same things. We still eat the same, live the same, buy the same things, value the same things. We still caught up in the latest styles. None of it changes. Our interactions with each other, the way we deal with relationships and marriages, is all the same. An American model. If it doesn't change those things, it don't make no sense of researching, studying, and reading about African history. Until you begin to incorporate that in your own life, it wouldn't even matter how many years, months, and days you researched, studied, and read about Africa, because it didn't change you as an individual. The whole idea behind it is to get you out of that state of mind, to change you as an individual, to cause you to go through the process of changing your total being. If you're not prepared to do that, it don't make no sense of reading about all of these different things of Africa. All the historians that I mentioned, Dr. Ben, Yusuf Ben Chikanan, Sheikh Anta Diop, Theophilo Benga, Ivan Van Sertima, John G. Jackson, Chancellor Williams. I mean, reading about all these different historians and their writings about Africa, it's not going to matter if you're not going to change yourself. It all starts with self. Because you have to think beyond yourself, that this is bigger than you. Think about your children that's growing up in America with the same way of thinking that you was under. I have two nieces from my nephew. They're my great nieces, because he's my nephew, so they're my great nieces. And one day in the car, I was with them in my nephew's car, and both of them told me, "No, I'm not black, I'm brown." I said, "You what?" "I'm brown." I said, no such thing. "No, you're black." "No, we brown. We not black, we brown." This was shocking to me to hear them say that. I had to constantly tell them that they are black and to explain to them why they are black and not brown. See, this is the negative perception about black, even at that tender age. Because they was like 8, one was 8, and one was 5. Yeah, at those tender ages, they didn't even want to identify with being black. They said they were brown, not black. And my nephew was in the car, so was their mother and their sister, who was 22 years old. And they all was just listening to me explaining why they were black and not brown. That was shocking to me. That little children don't even want to identify with being black. And this is in my own family. So I'm saying, I'm pretty sure that that's not an exception just in my family. Many black children are growing up today not even understanding or even wanting to acknowledge or even identify with being black. That's because they don't know. No one is teaching them the importance of what it means to identify with being black, to identify with your own identity as a people. That's not being taught from their mothers and fathers because they themselves didn't identify with that when they were children. And it's because their mothers and fathers didn't identify with it. So it's a whole cycle repeating itself over and over again. So we need to take the step forward to change that. And it starts today. With that, I'm going to say peace and blessings.